Our next presentation comes from Paul Richmond from the University of Sheffield, where he'll be presenting centralized versus decentralized skills.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Paul Richmond from the University of Sheffield. Inspired by a rant that I could no longer remember, Mark asked me to come and talk about the dangers and risks of centralization in high-performance computing skills. And I said I'd be absolutely delighted to do that in front of the directors of all major HP facilities in the UK. What could possibly go wrong with that? Rather than repeat the rant that I had to Mark, I thought, well, actually what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about something I do know about, which is the research software engineering community, and then maybe think about what the impact of centralization has been on the RSE community, and see if we can draw some analogy with the broader HPC and RTP communities, mostly so I could save this situation happening. Why should we do that though? Well, the RSE community has been tremendously successful in building and distributing skills. So I'm a professor of research software engineering. I'd like to say that's because I've been successful in building groups and collaborations. It's mostly because I've brought in just enough money to hide the fact that I don't like writing papers. But like most RSEs, I kind of was introduced to the idea of research software engineering through the RSE Association. So I was not one of the founding fathers of RSE. I wasn't in the room when the term was coined. I came to it through this very kind of inclusive list of things that came to me just the right time, because I was having the crisis of confidence in academia, where I realised that actually what I was a facilitator of other people's research. I liked writing software, and this helped me kind of find my place in my community. The RSE community has been extremely successful, from those kind of humble beginnings. It has grown as a grassroots kind of organisation through the RSE Association, through to now the RSE Society, which is a charitable members organisation with over 700 members. There's over 6,000 people on the UK RSE General Slack channel. And the conference regularly attracts over 400 people, including international attendees. So there's things like regional groups, where there's I think there's at least 8 that I've counted, kind of regional hubs which focus on RSE skills. And we've exported this kind of internationally. There are, I think there's around about 9 RSE associations internationally. The US has recently just had its kind of second international RSE conference. So by all accounts, it's been a tremendous success at kind of generating and redistributing skills. I think that there are some specific success factors that have kind of contributed to this. So one is that I think this has been a bottom-up kind of movement. Right? It's been a grassroots thing that's come from the people, the RSEs themselves. And that's meant that there's been very little kind of centralised funding to support this initiative. People have mainly kind of self-organised. I think that there's been kind of disillusionment within academia about the fact that there are lots of people that are involved in kind of technical skills and writing software that haven't necessarily been recognised or rewarded. There's this old survey that and it is quite old now, but talking about the importance of research software, the fact that so many people are developing research code and so fewer people have had training to be able to do so. I think also there's been investment in the right places. So investment, and I'm possibly quite biased because I got investment quite early on. I was the recipient of an EPSRC Research Software Engineering Fellowship. This is equivalent to a kind of like an open fellowship, but it's an investment specifically in research software engineering and an investment in kind of future leaders within the community. And I think that was very well placed, because I think that has had a very positive impact on the community. Those people have gone off and done things like build groups and support kind of the careers of other RSEs. But most important, I think there's been an incredibly passionate community, right? So the RSE Association, the RSE Society is being led by volunteers. Huge numbers of people have supplied kind of lots and lots of their time to make sure that RSE has been a success. I think centralization then is something that has worked incredibly well within the RSE community. Centralization within institutions in particular. So I think the RSE groups are one of the greatest successes of the community. There are over 40 groups within the UK. there's an RSE leaders network of kind of group leads that kind of support each other and help to support new kind of groups starting up. And it's been incredibly important at supporting research software engineers by creating these kind of groups that have meant that people who develop software, people that work within that space have had a home, right? It's meant that they haven't had to jump from short-term contracts. It's meant that they have had kind of sustainability. They've had skills exchange, peer support. They've effectively had a home. And this is something that is again, it's being exported. It's not just within the UK. There's RSE groups that have kind of cropped up kind of everywhere. I'd like to talk then a little bit about the kind of the impact, but then also some of the kind of the caveats around this idea of centralising RSE skills within a group. So it's important to recognise that centralising RSE skills within a group, within an institution, is not an investment in kind of like in the centre even. There's an argument that investment of an RSE group is really an investment in the decentralised kind of researchers that benefit from them, right? The reason I say that is because RSEs, they're not just developers, right? They're not just software engineers. They have this art part of RSE as well, which is the research component. They tend to be embedded within groups. They tend to leave something behind. They tend to work with other researchers and upskill them. By having centralised groups, it means that this can support a much broader range of research. So we can support the long tail of research, which is all of the smaller grants that would otherwise not be able to fund dedicated software engineering support. So those that have got, like, say, a single postdoc can use part of that pool model and get something that they couldn't before. So centralisation, in a sense, has been an investment in kind of supporting software in a much more decentralised way. So what's about the kind of the impact of RSE groups and centralisation of skills within groups on the diversity of RSE roles? So anyone that's heard any talk about research software engineering has probably seen this diagram at some point, and it's rather simplistic. It does a reasonable job of representing what an RSE is, somewhere between a researcher and a software engineer. But the reality is that the community is much more diverse than this, and there are all kinds of different dimensions that exist within it. So one of the most important, I think, is this idea of central team and embedded. So this line is kind of slightly skewed. If you're in a central team, you might be kind of slightly closer to a software engineer. If you're embedded, you might be kind of slightly closer to the research space. But there are many different kinds of RSEs within the community, and I think that our diversity is probably our greatest strength, the fact that we have kind of specialisms in different technological aspects as well as different research domains. But that said, RSEs have effectively outgrown this label. There are so many other kind of technological professionals that exist adjacent to kind of the writing of software that we've kind of embraced this term research technology professionals. And there's been quite a bit of movement recently in trying to kind of support this much broader space of technological people that exist within the research environment. And this is really, really good, right? We want to embrace it. We want to have better kind of recognition and reward of all people that contribute towards research. But I think particularly with the RSE community, there is a risk that this RTP push is there's somewhat of a hang-up around the word kind of technical, and particularly around the word kind of technician. So my concern with this is really that it kind of pushes us into spaces of that diagram that we saw previously that move us slightly away from research. And my concern with that is that it becomes just a service rather than a collaboration. It depends really on what this diagram kind of looks like, right? Because if RSEs are part of this kind of research technology program, then that's absolutely fine. But that's only fine as long as we don't ignore elements of that community and elements of the RSE community that are kind of closer and more adjacent to research than there might be kind of the technical space. It could be that the diagram actually looks something like this. and that RSEs are some kind of special case of RTPs. I don't think that this is the case at all, actually. I think that there are RTPs in other areas, such as high-performance computing and AI, where there are kind of novel contributions that are being made. HPC, obviously, is a research field in itself, and there is a transition between that kind of novel research through to kind of application of that research. So actually, I think that the RTPs and RSEs are one of the same. I've tried to kind of highlight this kind of issue that we have, though, around certainly the technical professional and the research RSE by describing it as kind of the duality of RSE-like roles. So this is to reflect really the fact that ultimately, when you're in a research environment, you are kind of really one or the other. And I know there are exceptions to this, and James is in the room. I know that you're going to kind of flag me up on this because UCL have been great at kind of closing this gap, but that's not true across the board. It's generally the case that you're either kind of a professional services or technical member of staff, or you're a researcher. And if you're a technical professional, the chances are you're probably in a central group. You probably occupy this bit of space here. You're in a central group. You're measured against, or not measured against research outputs necessarily. The research agenda might be set by others. If you're a research RSE, then you might be kind of much closer to the research. You're more likely to be perhaps embedded, more likely to have your own research agenda, or at least be much closer to that research agenda because you're part of a specific kind of domain. And importantly, you will be measured as a researcher or an academic, perhaps on an academic career pathway. So, I'll try to kind of summarise what I see as some of the challenges of RSE centralisation then, and then we'll move on to trying to draw some analogy with the HPC community. So first of all, for RSE centralisation to be successful, there must be a transfer of skills from the centralised unit. Right, so RSE models and group models are built specifically to do this. By embedding people into teams, they support the long tail of research. They do this very, very effectively. I am concerned that centralisation can isolate embedded staff. So with RSE groups being such a success, there is a risk that people think, this is a solved problem. All RSEs sit in groups, and that is exactly what an RSE should look like, and that is not the case. There are RSEs who sit within dedicated research teams that sit within domains, and they are hugely, hugely important because they are an essential link between that domain and the technological subject. So without sufficient scale, centralised teams tend towards generalists. So I've said this because I think there's such a fundamental problem with the way in which we develop software. There's such an enormous need for research software engineering that kind of everyone almost needs it. And it's so easy to find people within institutions that need even the most basic levels of help, even around things like version control and just how to write kind of good quality code, that it's difficult to sustain specialist skills unless you kind of can scale the size of your group to kind of be able to support that. So I also think that this issue of the duality of the RSE role can hinder mobility. So I think the fact that this gap is not closed, the fact that if you're on one contract or another, you perhaps have different incentives and different methods of recognition and reward means that it's very difficult to transition between the two, either between institutions or even within your own organisation. So, let's see if we can draw any analogy. And I'm kind of reaching a little bit here, but come with me, follow me, and we'll see what happens. So the first thing I suggested then is there must be a transfer of skills from the centralised unit. So if we think about that in terms of high-performance computing community, it's kind of another level up because we're talking about kind of centralised national services or regional services. So by this, I think a transfer of skills from the centralised unit means that we need to ensure that we transfer skills from Tier 1 and Tier 2 centres. I think that if this is going to be scalable, it needs to follow the same type of model as research software engineering. There's been lots of success in doing this through things like Excalibur and the Archer ECSE program. But I think, if we want to continue to do this, we need to make sure that investment that we have goes beyond just the initial investment. We need to leverage the same mechanisms that RSEs have to make this something that can kind of grow in a sustainable way and that we can keep kind of skills coming back into the research community rather than being centralised in kind of a single place. So I think that centralisation, so the next point, sorry, was centralisation can isolate embedded staff. So this I do think is quite a problem, particularly for local HPC facilities. I think if all of our high performance computing skills are embedded in kind of central places, then there's a risk of kind of brain drain and people kind of being moved to those. I don't think there's enough incentive to exist within decentralised locations, and as a result I think that they're probably quite fragile. So when you look at local facilities at local institutions, they have the same problem that software initially have, and that there are robust factors of one when it comes to certain facilities, particularly around important roles like sysadmins that kind of Paul raised. And it's very difficult to kind of incentivise people to come to local institutions when there are big facilities that may be kind of more attractive to go to. So it's really important that we kind of close that gap and find ways of investing. I think the best way to close that gap, by the way, is an investment into software. And Paul kind of, again, stole my idea of saying we have no software strategy plan, and I think that is a significant problem. I think software is a great leveller for kind of bringing localised researchers and localised staff and kind of linking them with some of the staff that exists, specialist staff within Tier 1 and Tier 2 centres. So the next point I made then is without sufficient scale, centralised teams tend towards generalists. I think everyone is aware of the risk of kind of single machines and architectures being quite dangerous. Obviously we need to kind of invest in a range of different architectures. The Tier 2 facilities are an excellent way of doing this. They created kind of somewhat of a bridge. They made the pyramid kind of a nice pyramid shape. The risk of investing everything all in one place as it starts to look like a tower, and that can not be healthy at all. But I think the other thing we need to do is invest in future leaders. So again, as I said, I'm slightly biased with this because I benefited greatly from this, but I do think that investing in future leaders is an excellent way to diversify skills and build communities, particularly communities that link kind of localised research or localised domains and the big facilities that they're likely to make use of. The RSE fellowships, as I said, were a fantastic initiative, and the result of that, things have moved on, and now the open fellowship format is open, which means that RSE-like people and RTPs can apply for it. The problem that I see with that is that it's not targeting specifically kind of RSEs or RTPs. It's very difficult to ascertain whether or not that's been a success for that community. I suspect that far fewer of those RTPs have applied for open fellowships. It's very difficult to get that information from grants on the web, but certainly from kind of trying to read through what's been awarded, there are far fewer RTPs getting awards than if there are dedicated investments into community building fellowships like RSE fellowships. So lastly then, this kind of duality of the RSE and RTP role hindering mobility. Well, I think that we certainly need to kind of close this gap. This kind of mobility needs to be kind of improved, and that requires effort on kind of both sides to improve the visibility and the recognition and reward of technical professionals on technical contracts, but also to change the way that we assess research and to reflect the fact that there are researchers, research software engineers and research technology professionals on research contracts that are very active in contributing kind of towards research. I think if we can close that gap, and it doesn't really matter whether you're on a technical or a research contract, but there's certainly a gap at the moment, and I think we can do far better. I think one of the ways is to improve research assessment, so things like REF can be improved, and although there's been some substantial changes to REF, I don't know that they are substantial enough to be able to kind of close this gap this time round. Certainly RTPs are eligible, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they will be put forwards. Things like the hidden REF and the 5% manifesto are a much kind of better way in making sure that there is a better reflection of people that kind of contribute towards research as part of that. So I think to summarise then, centralisation is a good thing, but as long as it supports the upskilling of decentralised staff. Right? I think it is very, very difficult to bridge that gap. I think it's very difficult to bridge the gap between kind of large capital investments and kind of decentralised institutions and researchers. It's very difficult without kind of large investments into things like software and future leaders. I think the RSE and RTP is not a solved problem. I think there's improvement needed in mobility. I think there's improvement needed in recognition and reward of those people. And I think that an investment and long-term strategy is needed in both central resources, things like Tier 2 facilities where there's a huge amount of uncertainty, future leaders, and I've said it so many times, but investment into software. Okay, that's P.
Any questions for Paul?
Thank you. That was really interesting. So I've got a question about centralization and the role of funding, if you like. So arguably, it's centres like EPCC, Hartree, Scientific Computing, perhaps UCL, a few big centres which have cracked the problem of how to do career development and allow people to progress while staying in a centre. And to me, that's one of the biggest obstacles, I think, to growing the RSE movement across a whole range of universities. So how do you see that changing, and do you agree that that's an obstacle?
I think the problem kind of shifts slightly for H-Pacific, because I think, likewise, I think kind of RSE groups are kind of replicating that for kind of RSEs, right? So they're making kind of strides in improving the career progression of RSEs within local institutions, and it is different in different institutions. What you do in UCL will be very difficult to do in Sheffield, very difficult to do in kind of Cambridge. There are local kind of politics and histories and things that make kind of make it difficult to have the same case applied to all. I think places like STFC and EPCC can naturally scale their kind of career progression for more specialist roles, like high-performance computing roles. And I think that is wonderful. What we need to make sure happens is that same career progression for kind of more specialist roles is reflected at the kind of the lower kind of points within the pyramid, because we don't just want those central facilities to be the only place in which your career can progress. We want to make sure that the sysadmins and the various other different RTP roles at Sheffield have got the opportunity to kind of build skills and progress their careers. And I don't think they can do that without, some form of integration and utilisation of these kind of potential things like STFC and EPCC.
Thank you very much for that talk. So I'm an RSE in a local group, small group, which is great. It's great that it's been set up. One of the issues that we're facing is short-term contracts. So the university has basically put us on postdoc contracts, and they're ended in 3 years. And yeah, what would you say would have been? How do we fix that? Was it setting it up in the first place, like getting a new contract, a new career pathway set up properly before they started the team, or and how do we change it?
I think it's very dependent on your institution and who you can kind of lobby to kind of get that in place. I think the best thing to do is engage with the RSE Leaders Network. I think you will find, as I said, there's 40 different groups who have all found their own way of making this happen within institutions, and some still have kind of short-term contracts, but a lot of them have managed to kind of move that onto open-ended contracts. The key to that is presenting it to institutions as not something that's going to cost them anything, but actually it's going to be kind of a net benefit. And generally an RSE group doesn't cost anything because they're being costed out onto research projects. It should be cost neutral. The only thing the institution has to do is take a risk to underwrite them. And that risk is relatively low when you look at the fact that there are 40 RSE groups that are doing this successfully and continuing to grow. And you look at the level of support that is needed around software, the supply is pretty great. So yeah.
So given that there's central examples of like Hartree, there's 40 universities that have solved it. is it time to mandate to the other universities that this is how you have to do it? So start writing it as a requirement if you're for funding for software engineers and things, that you must have this in place, of some kind of.
Have what in place? Sorry.
You must have a career progression in place, otherwise you won't be allowed to apply for funding for that type of role, or would that be counterproductive?
I don't know, honestly, Mark. Maybe that's something to explore in the panel, but I think mandating things is a very blunt instrument. I think incentivising institutions to do it is perhaps a much nicer way. I do think it's very difficult to create that link, though, between local institutions and, say, kind of Hartree or SCFC without creating opportunities in which you can kind of embed staff from both of those organisations. So things like the ECSE programme Excalibur are vitally important in kind of connecting those two and bridging that gap. Yeah.
Two short questions. One is most universities, or many, have something like a Digital Society Institute, Digital Futures Institute. So is this umbrella under which RSEs are engaging with? And the other one is your RSE community. You said 400 or 500. Is this entirely under university? Are they all under university contracts, or is there a fraction in industry?
And I'll try and remember both of those questions. So I'll do the second one last. So 400 people, that's how many people attend the conference each year, and that's limited to kind of 400. That's just in person, I think. So online there are far more. And that the community of people that attend that are not just people that are on university contracts. As I said, the RSE community is incredibly diverse, and that includes people working within industrial R&D, includes people in national labs, it includes the embedded researcher that undertakes the practice of research software engineering, even if they're not employed directly within a role that says research software engineering, as well as all of the groups. So the community is much bigger than just the conference. What was the first question again?
The link between RSE and Digital Futures.
Okay, yeah. So again, this depends. So when I talked about the idea of the kind of the technical professional RSE being in centralised groups, that's much more likely to be aligned with something like that. It's not universally the case. RSE groups exist in different places within organisations, quite often within kind of central IT or kind of digital research institutes, but not exclusively. I think one of the very nice ways to expand and close the gap is to have kind of domain specialised research software engineering groups. So Cambridge, for example, have got ICCS, Institute of Computing for Climate Science. That is research software engineers with domain backgrounds that are bridging that gap between a certain area of research and high performance computing and AI. Same for things like Dirac, where you've got very specialist kind of research software engineers with lots of domain background. And I think we need much more of that. I think we need more of that. And it works quite well. It doesn't have to be completely separate. It can work with a hub and spoke like model, and they should be kind of connected into those central kind of RSE teams. But I think there's lots of scope for RSEs to sit kind of and RTPs to sit all over kind of organisations, really. And they should.
Paul Richmond, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.